Every Monday for 11 years, the same delivery van pulled up outside a welding shop on the edge of Sudbury, dropped off a cracked steel frame nobody else wanted to touch, and drove away without a word. No note, no thank you, no name attached to the invoice, just tonnage and a deadline. The man who ran the shop never once saw the face of the company that kept him afloat. Then one February morning, the van didn't come. Instead, a black SUV pulled into the gravel lot, and the CEO, who'd never bothered to learn his name, stepped out looking like she hadn't slept in a week. Callum Whitlock was 44, and his hands told most of his story before he ever opened his mouth. Burn scars along the left forearm, knuckles permanently swollen from 20 years of grip work, a smell of flux and hot metal that never quite washed out. He was tall in the way that made low doorways a daily hazard, quiet in the way that made people assume he was slow, which he wasn't. His shop sat past the last strip mall on Falconbridge Road, where the pavement gave up and gravel took over. A hand-lettered sign. A propane heater that only worked half the year. One bay, one torch, one man who could look at a broken weld, and tell you exactly how it had failed before he even touched it. 7 years earlier, Callum had buried his wife, Denise, after a car accident on Highway 17 that he still couldn't drive past without his chest going tight. Their daughter, Wren, no, that name was already used. Their daughter, Amelie, had been 5. She was 12 now, sharp-tongued, quick to laugh, the kind of kid who'd learned to read a room for trouble before she'd learned long division. Callum built a life around her out of sheer repetition. Up at 5:30, lunch packed the night before, drop-off, shop work, pick-up, homework at the same folding table where he sorted invoices, dinner, usually something out of a slow cooker because it was the one appliance that didn't need watching. No days off that weren't really days off, no safety net, just Monday, and the van, and whatever it brought. Before Denise died, before the shop, before any of it, Callum had been a structural welding engineer at Larkhaven Steel, one of the mid-sized fabrication firms that fed into Ontario's mining and construction sector. He hadn't just welded, he'd designed load paths, signed off on stress calculations, caught failures in blueprints before they became failures in the field. He liked the work, he was good at it, and for a few years it felt like something that might actually hold. Then Larkhaven got bought out by a bigger outfit chasing efficiency, and efficiency turned out to mean cutting the engineering bench in half. Callum's position was one of the ones that didn't survive the spreadsheet. That was 8 months before Denise's accident. The two losses landed close enough together that he sometimes couldn't remember which grief belonged to which event. He took over his uncle's old welding shop because it was there, and because a mortgage doesn't care that your world just ended. Small jobs at first, trailer hitches, fence gates, farm equipment. Then, without explanation, Larkhaven Steel started sending him work. Not through any relationship. Through a subcontracting arrangement nobody at head office seemed to remember signing. Every Monday, cracked frames, failed welds on load-bearing components, prototype brackets that had snapped during testing and gotten quietly routed away from the main shop floor so nobody upstairs would ask questions. Callum fixed every single one, not because the company deserved it, because Amelie needed shoes that fit and a roof that didn't leak. And a contract that paid on time, even coldly, was still a contract that paid. For 11 years Victoria, the CEO who'd taken over Larkhaven after the buyout, never set foot near that gravel lot. She wouldn't have recognized Callum's name if it had been read to her out loud. She was 39, and by most public measures she'd done everything right. Under her, Larkhaven had gone from a regional supplier to a name recognized across 3 provinces. Trade magazines ran her photo next to words like visionary and relentless. Investors loved the growth curve. What they didn't see was what the growth curve had been built on: quietly reduced inspection cycles. Suppliers chosen for price over certification, engineering headcount trimmed year after year, until the people actually catching problems before they shipped were down to a skeleton crew. For a long time, nothing broke that couldn't be fixed quietly and routed around. Then something broke that couldn't be. It started with a failed batch of support brackets on a mining conveyor system. The kind of failure that doesn't make headlines until it does. Then a second failure, this one at an active job site, caught before anyone got hurt, but not before it got photographed. Regulators started asking for documentation. A major client froze a contract pending review. The board, which had spent a decade praising Victoria's instincts, started asking different questions in closed session. Within 6 weeks, Larkhaven's stock had lost a third of its value, and 2 senior engineers had resigned, rather than have their names attached to what an internal audit was starting to uncover. Victoria sat in an emergency session at 11 at night, going through a supplier and subcontractor list that nobody had actually read in years, and found something that stopped her cold. A line item, paid consistently for over a decade, for structural repair and remediation work. Invoiced modestly, approved automatically, never once reviewed. The repair rate attached to that contractor's name was higher than Larkhaven's own certified shop floor. Not slightly higher, dramatically higher. 11 years of failed components sent out quietly, fixed quietly, returned without a single complaint or a single conversation. The name on the file was Callum Whitlock. She read it twice. 11 years, hundreds of components. A man she had never met, never called, never once thought to ask about, had apparently been catching Larkhaven's worst engineering failures before they became public disasters. And now the newest structural platform, the one Larkhaven was betting its recovery on, had failed catastrophic testing. Again, if it couldn't be resolved fast, there wouldn't be a recovery to bet on. So on a gray Thursday morning, with no assistant, no press, no one from legal briefed to manage the visit, Victoria drove out past the last strip mall on Falconbridge Road, and parked her SUV next to a propane heater and a stack of rusted rebar. Inside, Callum was midway through a repair, sparks throwing long shadows across the concrete floor, while Amelie sat at the folding table doing math homework with a space heater angled at her feet. The door chime, an actual bell, not electronic, startled them both. Callum recognized her before she said a word. Everyone in structural fabrication knew Victoria's face. She'd been on enough panels and magazine spreads that she was hard to miss, even standing awkwardly in a doorway, in a coat that wasn't built for a Sudbury winter. There was a strange heavy quiet in the shop for a moment. The woman whose company had been dumping broken steel at his door for over a decade now standing in the same doorway, not sending an invoice, but asking, in person, for help. He set down the torch. Amelie watched, pencil frozen mid-problem. Victoria didn't try to dress it up. She told him plainly, more plainly than she'd told her own board, that Larkhaven was in real trouble, that the new platform had failed, that if it wasn't fixed properly and fast, layoffs weren't a possibility anymore, they were the plan. She needed someone who actually understood why things failed, not someone who could produce a report explaining why it wasn't anyone's fault. Callum didn't answer right away. He looked over at Amelie, who was pretending very hard to be absorbed in fractions. Then back at Victoria. There was a lot sitting in that pause. 11 years of a company that had used him without ever once asking his name, that had shed his old job and, indirectly, shed the stability that might have kept things from unraveling quite so hard after Denise died. He owed Larkhaven nothing, and some quiet, tired part of him wanted to say so. But it wasn't just Victoria standing in front of him anymore. It was every welder, every line worker, every parts clerk at that company, who had families the same size and shape as his, who had no idea their jobs were currently balanced on a spreadsheet. Nobody upstairs had thought to check in 10 years. Callum understood exactly what it meant to have your stability decided by people who'd never met you. He didn't want to be the reason it happened to someone else, even at a company that had never once said thank you. "I'll look at it," he said, not promising anything. It was enough. It was more than Victoria had any right to expect. Over the following 3 weeks, Callum worked out of Larkhaven's main facility during the day, and drove back to Amelie every evening without exception. That part wasn't negotiable, and to her credit, Victoria never once suggested it should be. What he found in the new platform's design wasn't a single catastrophic error. It was a slow accumulation of small ones. Inspection steps quietly skipped, a supplier switched for a cheaper alternative, without recertifying the material, load calculations that had been copied forward from an older design instead of redone. Nothing dramatic. Just years of corners cut so gradually that no single decision looked reckless on its own. He didn't rebuild the platform from scratch, he simplified it. Stripped out the over-engineered patches that had been layered on top of the real problem, instead of fixing it, and went back to fundamentals. The same instinct that had let him diagnose a stranger's failing weld from 3 feet away without touching it. Slow, methodical, unglamorous work. the kind that doesn't photograph well but holds. Victoria stayed close during those 3 weeks, not managing him, just watching. She noticed the way he explained things to Larkhaven's younger engineers, without making them feel small for not already knowing. She noticed he left at the exact same time every day, no exceptions, no apologies for it. She noticed he never once brought up the 11 years, never used it as leverage, never made her feel smaller than she already felt sitting across from him, in a hard hat that clearly didn't belong to her. One night, after a stretch that had run past 10 o'clock, Victoria drove out to the shop instead of home. Not for the platform, she told him that, and he seemed to believe her. She found Amelie sorting a stack of paid invoices into a shoebox by date, and Callum wiping down tools before shutting the bay lights off, and a pot of something simmering on a hot plate in the back office, because the microwave had finally given out. It was a small life, built entirely out of discipline instead of comfort, and it hit her harder than any board meeting had in years. She'd spent a decade optimizing systems, and had somehow never once looked closely enough at the people those systems ran on top of. The new platform passed certification 5 weeks later. Not flawless, nothing rebuilt from a decade of shortcuts ever comes out flawless, but honest and holding. The stock stabilized. The board, for the first time in months, stopped talking about worst-case scenarios in every meeting. Victoria offered Callum a permanent role, Director of Structural Integrity, full authority to sign off on what did and didn't ship, and terms she built around his life instead of asking him to rebuild his life around the job. No relocation, no travel beyond what he chose. School pickup stayed non-negotiable, and she said so herself first before he even had to ask. He thought about it for 4 days before he said yes. Not out of relief, out of the same instinct that had made him agree to look at the platform in the first place. Because it mattered, and because he was tired of watching companies find out the hard way what happens when they stop paying attention to who's actually holding things together. The Mondays looked different after that. No unmarked van, no cold invoice. Larkhaven and Callum's shop, which he kept running on the side, smaller now, mostly local work, built something that actually resembled a partnership, built on people who knew each other's names. Amelie told her friends her dad basically saved a whole company, which wasn't far off. Victoria stopped by the shop sometimes with no agenda at all, just coffee and conversation. Something she hadn't done with anyone in years that wasn't tied to a quarterly target. She'd spent 11 years running numbers on a spreadsheet that never once told her the truth that mattered most. A company doesn't survive on scales or branding or confidence at the top. It survives because somewhere, usually overlooked, someone is still willing to fix what everyone else already gave up on.